In 1581, more than 40,000 soldiers surrounded a single mountain province. Their orders were simple: leave nothing standing. The people inside were Japan's most feared intelligence operatives. What happens when the ninja face open war and lose? "46,000 soldiers, one mountain province. Japan's greatest military force descended on the ninja homeland, and the people inside weren't supposed to fight back. What happens when the most feared spies in Japan are forced into open war? The province of Iga sits at the center of the Japanese archipelago, ringed by mountain ranges that made it difficult to reach and nearly impossible to hold. For centuries, this isolation bred something unusual: communities of men and women who sold a specific set of skills: intelligence gathering, infiltration, and disruption to warlords who could afford to pay. They were not the black-clad assassins of later legend. They were specialists in the art of not being seen, and they operated with an independence that no single lord had been able to break. What made Iga remarkable was not any single warrior, but its structure. Unlike every other domain in Japan, Iga had no central lord. It was governed by a loose confederation of warrior families, an iki, in which power was shared, disputed, and occasionally fought over, but never surrendered to an outsider. This independence was by design. A province with no master could serve every master. By the mid-16th century, Iga Shinobi were working for warlords across Japan simultaneously, selling intelligence to rivals without ever committing to a single side. The skills the Iga warriors trained in were not flashy. They learned to move through terrain without leaving traces, to change appearance, to gather information from enemy camps without raising suspicion, and to disappear before anyone thought to look. They also trained in conventional fighting techniques, necessary for when intelligence work went wrong. But their primary value was always information. In an era when a warlord's survival depended on knowing what enemies were planning before the plans became armies, Iga offered something no amount of military strength could replicate. Oda Nobunaga had one policy for every domain he encountered: submit or cease to exist. He had applied this principle to temples, rival warlords, and entire peasant rebellions with the same cold efficiency. Iga was different. Its lack of a central lord meant there was no one whose surrender Nobunaga could accept. Its mountain geography made conventional invasion costly, and its shinobi had occasionally been hired by Nobunaga's own enemies. For a man who required absolute loyalty from everyone in his orbit, Iga represented an irritant he could not ignore, and had not yet learned how to remove. In 1579, Nobunaga's second son, Oda Nobunaga, launched the first serious invasion of Iga without his father's permission or knowledge. He brought roughly 10,000 soldiers into the mountain passes and met an immediate disaster. Iga's warriors had no intention of standing in formation and fighting like a conventional army. They used the terrain, attacked supply lines, targeted commanders, and vanished before counterattacks could form. Nobukatsu lost several of his best officers and retreated in humiliation. In Iga, the failed invasion became a source of local pride. In Nobunaga's court, it was something far more dangerous, an insult.
Nobunaga's response to his son's failure was public and calculated. He reprimanded Nobukatsu in front of his court, a ritual humiliation that made clear the fault lay entirely with the son, not the plan itself. Privately, he began a different kind of preparation. The second invasion of Iga would not be a raid. It would be organized like a siege, methodical, overwhelming, designed to close every exit before the campaign began. For 2 years, Nobunaga gathered resources, identified every mountain pass into the province, and recruited commanders who understood that this time, nothing could go wrong.
By September of 1581, the preparations were complete. Nobunaga assembled a force estimated at more than 40,000 soldiers, a number that dwarfed anything Iga's warriors could realistically oppose. The campaign was designed around one principle: simultaneous entry from every direction. 6 separate columns would enter Iga through 6 separate mountain passes at the same time. There would be no direction to retreat to, no neighboring domain to seek shelter in, no gap in the line to slip through. What Nobunaga intended was not a battle. It was an erasure. The columns moved in September 1581 from the north, south, east, west, and through the central passes. Oda forces poured into Iga simultaneously. The Iga warriors had known this was coming. The scale of Nobunaga's preparations could not be entirely hidden. Some had already moved their families to mountain retreats. Others prepared to fight as they always had, not in open formation, but in ambushes, in night raids, from positions the enemy could not easily reach. For the first weeks, the resistance was fierce. The Oda column slowed. People died on both sides.
But the mathematics were impossible. Every ambush that succeeded brought 3 more columns behind it. Every Iga position that held was eventually bypassed or surrounded. The fighters who might have escaped earlier now found the passes blocked. Villages that refused to surrender were burned. The province that had resisted for generations was being taken apart systematically, one valley at a time. Iga's greatest advantage, the terrain, had been neutralized by sheer numbers. There were simply too many soldiers to ambush, too many columns to delay, too many fires to put out at once.
Nobunaga's commanders operated under explicit orders. Take no prisoners among the fighting men. Destroy the villages that had sheltered them. The province was not being conquered. It was being cleared. Observers who recorded the campaign described scenes of mass killing and systematic burning that left entire valleys empty. The mountainous terrain that had once made Iga impossible to hold now made it impossible to escape. By the time the campaign ended, the Iga that had existed as an independent power for centuries was gone. What remained was ash and silence.
Not everyone died. The Iga warriors who survived were the ones who had read what was coming early enough to act on it. In the days and weeks before the 6 columns arrived, many shinobi families had already slipped out through routes they knew and the invaders did not. They carried what they could: tools, documents, the knowledge and techniques that defined their trade. They scattered across Japan, north to the Tohoku, east toward the Kanto, west into the territories of lords who had no loyalty to Nobunaga, and every reason to welcome people who knew things.
Nobunaga arrived in the ruins of Iga shortly after the campaign ended, and held what was described as a triumphal review of the devastated province. He rewarded his commanders with territories carved from what remained, and moved on to his next problem. He would not survive to see what that scattering produced. In June 1582, 8 months after his victory tour of Iga, Nobunaga was ambushed and killed at the Honnoji Temple in Kyoto. Not by any ninja, but by one of his most trusted generals, Akechi Mitsuhide.
The man who benefited most from Nobunaga's death was Tokugawa Ieyasu, who happened to be in Sakai, far from his own territory when the assassination occurred. He needed to return to his domain through hostile territory as quickly as possible. The route he chose ran through what had been Iga province, and the people who guided him safely home through the mountain passes, protecting him from the forces hunting him, were Iga warriors, the survivors of the province Nobunaga had destroyed just months before. One of those survivors was Hattori Hanzo.
The Iga Uprising produced an irony that the people who ordered it could not have foreseen. By destroying Iga as a place, Nobunaga scattered the people who made it what it was. Iga shinobi, who might otherwise have spent their lives in the same province, serving the same lords in the same mountains, were now distributed across Japan. Every domain that offered them shelter received, along with the refugees, the accumulated intelligence techniques of a tradition that had been developing for over a century. The destruction of Iga had not ended the ninja. It had exported them.
Tokugawa Ieyasu, who understood exactly what the Iga survivors had risked to help him, incorporated them into the institutional structure of the Tokugawa government. Iga and Koga warriors formed the core of the shogunate's intelligence and security apparatus for the next 2.5 centuries. The skills that Nobunaga had tried to eliminate became the foundation of the most stable government Japan had ever seen. The irony was complete. The men who survived the shogunate's predecessor helped build the system that replaced it.
What the Iga Uprising reveals is something about the nature of knowledge under pressure. The shinobi tradition had always been a form of knowledge, not just techniques, but a way of thinking about problems. How do you obtain information in an environment where information is guarded? How do you move through space that someone else controls? How do you survive when the people hunting you are stronger? These questions didn't disappear when Iga burned. If anything, the burning made them more urgent. The survivors brought their answers with them wherever they went.
There is also something in this story about the limits of overwhelming force. Nobunaga brought 46,000 soldiers to destroy a few thousand specialists and their families. He succeeded in destroying the place. He could not destroy the knowledge the place had produced, the techniques, the networks, the accumulated understanding of how to operate in the shadows of power. These survived in the people who carried them. In trying to erase the ninja completely, Nobunaga ensured they would be everywhere. Sometimes the most durable thing about a tradition is that it cannot be burned into non-existence.
Next time on Samurai Chronicles, every samurai was supposed to follow a strict code: loyalty, honor, death before surrender. But where did that code actually come from? The answer is more complicated and more recent than most people expect.
The Iga Uprising tends to get lost between Nobunaga's rise and his death at Honnoji. But the warriors scattered by that campaign built the intelligence foundation of the Tokugawa shogunate, 2.5 centuries of stability. If you found this worth your time, subscribe. There are more stories like it. We'll see you next time.